Let me say that again. The whole history of America is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. It starts in the colonies of what would become the United States. Let's remember, during the colonial period, mid-1600s, there was no such thing as white people. I know some people who are now called white find that shocking, right? Because they think whiteness is real, right? But whiteness was created. Europeans didn't call themselves white. We didn't call ourselves white. We weren't all members of one big happy family. Are you kidding? Have you studied the history of Europe? The history of Europe was about killing each other. That's what we did in Europe. We just killed each other. Before we figured out there were other people to kill, we just killed each other, right? I mean, that was the history of Europe. The English hated the Irish, right? Northern Italians didn't even think that Southern Italians were Italians. The Germans hated everybody, and everybody hated their ass right back, right? There was no team called white, no race called white, but all of a sudden, in the middle of the 1600s, there was. Why? Why was it suddenly necessary to create this thing called the white race? Well, because rich people can count, that's why. And so rich folks looked around, the ones that owned all the land, you know, in the colonies, the colonial elite looked around and they realized something, that they were heavily outnumbered by African enslaved folks, by European indentured servants who were just one level above a slave, or other Europeans who weren't technically indentured servants, but they were still peasants, didn't have any money, didn't have any land, and they could do the math. They added it up and they were like, damn, we got to figure out a way to split these folks apart from one another or they're going to rise up and take our stuff.
In that sea of silence, where most who are called white would look away.
Highlanders and lowlanders just fought the hell out of each other. So there was no white race, but in the colonies of what would become the elite do, when you see that you're outnumbered by black and white folks who are penniless, landless, peasants, you have to do one of two things. You either have to kill them all, but you can't do that because who's going to work? Rich folks weren't going to. They had to get poor people to work. The whole point was to be a person of leisure back in those days. That was the goal, was not to work. So you couldn't kill them all. You didn't want to kill them all. You had to do the work yourself. You had to build your own levee, build your own house. No. Pick your own tobacco, harvest your own cotton. No, we're not going to do any of that. So you can't kill them, but you can co-opt them. And so the elite in Virginia, for example, in the colony, begins to give certain carrots to people of European descent, saying things like, you know, we're going to let you own a little land, not much, but just a little. And we're going to get rid of indentured servitude. Now you're free labor. And by the way, once you're free labor, you get 50 acres of land just because you're free labor, see? So we're going to cut you in on this deal. We're going to let you enter into contracts. We're going to let you testify in court. And here's the best of all, we're going to put you on the slave patrol to keep those people in line, right? The idea was you're still going to get your clock clean. We still don't like you. We still aren't going to really empower you or change your economic subordination, but we're going to make you honorary members of this team, and you're going to help us keep those other people down.
Tim Wise from Nashville, Tennessee, is not like the everyday white American. He never did feel less concerned, nor did look away from the sufferings of black Americans. Bravely, this respectable individual has devoted so much effort in exposing just how the American system was designed to work against black Americans.
So they got a little taste of power, and it did effectively divide and conquer those coalitions. Those rebellions began to stop almost instantly. Fast forward to the Civil War era, you have rich white folks in the South, where I come from, standing up and openly admitting that the reason they're prepared to secede from the Union, and the only reason they ever articulated publicly, ever, was to maintain and extend slavery and white supremacy. Because you own them, who's going to get the job? Not me. In other words, slavery actually undermined the wages and the wage base, the economic floor of the typical white working class or low-income person. But they were told, if these people are freed, they're going to take your job. No, fool, they got your job. That's the point. And so at some level, again, working class white people being harmed by white privilege, relatively being advantaged, right? Being given a leg up, being given a membership to the club, but in absolute terms being kept economically subordinated by the very thing that gave them a sense of superiority. How's that for irony? Then in the present era, this hasn't stopped. This is not ancient history. Now we have people running around insisting that we should close the border with Mexico because if we don't, the wages of working class people will continue to fall. The implication being that the only reason workers are paid like crap in this country is because the border is open. But if you believe that, you would actually have to believe that if that border were closed, that all these owners of capital and industry would just say, oh, well, you figured us out. Here, it's a raise. Do we really believe that the only thing keeping bosses from paying people more is the presence of low-wage, medium, semi-skilled labor from south of this artificial border? Is that really what we believe? We know that if that border is closed, it isn't going to be closed to capital. It isn't going to be closed to goods. If you have a border that can be crossed by capital looking for the highest return on investment or goods looking for the highest price, but labor is chained to its country of origin, how is that going to work to the benefit of working people? By definition, it doesn't. By definition, it immiserates the working class. Divide and conquer.
By breaking ranks, Mr. Wise inspired others to re-examine their own biases against black people and set their paths straight. His unconventional perspective shed light on hidden truths.
But the best example of all, perhaps, in the contemporary era, in the greater New Orleans area after Katrina. Here you have two communities that were the most hard hit. The lower Ninth Ward, mostly black community, 94% African American, about 40% official poverty rate, heavy working class community. And right across the canal, St. Bernard Parish, Chalmette, 95% white, also working class, high levels of poverty, economically very similar. And at the end of the day, in those first few days of September 2005, more similar than they probably would have realized. Because when those levees broke, they all got their stuff jacked. They all got their stuff destroyed. But if you had asked white folks in Chalmette, and I've done it, who was the cause of the problems in the greater New Orleans area prior to that flooding, they would have pointed across that canal at those black folks, wouldn't have called them black folks, and would have said, there, that's the problem. 70% of the white folks in St. Bernard Parish voted for David Duke, white supremacist, neo-Nazi, former head of the largest Ku Klux Klan group in the United States when he ran for governor in 1991. 7 out of 10 gladly voted for him because he was blaming black folks for all of their problems, and they bought it. What's the irony? The irony is that while they were blaming black people for their problems, while they were blaming black people for the conditions of the greater New Orleans area in which they lived, nobody was paying attention, least of all they, to the fact that these white elite politicians, either in Baton Rouge or in Washington, whose job it was to secure those levees, to make sure that levy funds were spent in the proper way and that they were spent at all.
Hello everyone, hope you're doing fine from wherever you're watching me from. One thing that I understand is that I know a lot of people like Dr. Tim Wise, oftentimes a lot of white people, but for some reasons why they don't like him, because he goes ahead black people. But we are all coming to realize that indeed black people are not the problem. Dr. Tim Wise has featured different topics when it comes to race and privilege, when it comes to Black Lives Matter, when it comes to the plight of black people, Mr. Donald Trump, and how he's going to take down the economy. And I feel like we also have other podcasters, like we have economics professors that have also told us all about this. We have seen the enormous collapse of the United States. We are facing the last capitalistic stages that the United States is facing today. And so when we try to connect all this, you'll see a pattern, right? You'll see a pattern of populism. You'll see a pattern of white nationalists or white nationalism. We'll see a pattern of white supremacy. You'll see a pattern of what is called white deflection. And so, as I said earlier, and I'll say it again, some of white people are always not ready for people to have these discussions. But you get to realize that this is so much long overdue discussion that we need to have. And so, brothers and sisters, I invite you to watch this video. This video is by Dr. Tim Wise. It is not one video, but it is a compilation of different videos of different important topics that he talked about, because I find them really significant because they hit on the head. So these discussions are really, really important to the United States today if we have to talk about them. Brothers and sisters, watch the video. I'll be back and then I'll be sharing my thoughts. And if you're watching me for the first time, I'm asking you to please subscribe to the channel, join the membership, and really get to see what I can offer you. For those always supporting me, man, I'm really, really grateful for the support that you trying to give me. For those always coming back, grateful for the support and everything that you do to my channel. So let's watch the video. I'll be back and then I'll be sharing my thoughts.
Those mostly white and mostly elite politicians did nothing. At the end of the day, it wasn't just the black folks in the lower ninth ward they didn't care about. They really couldn't have given a rat's ass about those poor and working class white folks either. And yet, when the people of Chalmette, people of St. Bernard Parish got back into session, first time they had a city council meeting, parish council meeting after the flooding, the lights aren't even on yet. The water isn't even hooked up. And the first order of business was to pass an ordinance saying that you couldn't rent property in St. Bernard Parish to anyone who wasn't a blood relative. Now, I'll leave it to your imagination as to why you'd want to pass a law. That law had never existed before. But now that it's been emptied out and you don't know who might come back, that's a damn good way to keep black people out, isn't it? Because if you're 95% white to begin with, if you pass an ordinance that says that, that's a great, you can't say no blacks need apply. You can't say no blacks allowed, but that was an ingenious way to get around the law. Now, they got caught. There was a lawsuit threatening, they got rid of the ordinance. But my point in bringing it up is to say, once again, divide and conquer is working. These white folks in Chalmette need to march across that canal and join hands with the black folks who've been sitting there more than willing to work with them for an awful long time, and march on Baton Rouge and march on DC and march on the Corps of Engineers and recognize their commonality of interest. But the whiteness and the lure of whiteness has tricked these have nothing in their bank account white people into believing that they got more in common with the rich white folks on St. Charles Avenue that didn't lose anything in that flooding than they have in common with the black working class folks who live about 500 yards away.
Supporting Tim Wise's claims, several studies show that racial disparities in income, wealth, education, imprisonment, and health outcomes persist to this day. The beliefs and narratives that black Americans have about institutional harm have long been studied by scholars in the health and social sciences and the humanities. Narratives about how institutions were designed to hold black people back also surfaced in several of the online focus groups Pew Research Center conducted with this study just last year. To measure the prevalence of these narratives of mistrust, they would conduct a survey of 4,736 black adults in the U.S. from September 12th to September 24th, 2023. First respondents were asked if they had ever heard a series of statements about how U.S. institutions might intentionally or negligently harm black people. Respondents were then asked if they thought these harms were also happening to black people today. Here are some key findings about black Americans' beliefs in institutional mistrust. 76% of black adults say black public officials today are singled out to be discredited in a way that doesn't happen to white public officials. 76% say police today do very little to stop guns and drugs from flooding black communities. 74% say black people are more likely than white people to be incarcerated because prisons want to make money on the backs of black people today. 67% of black Americans say businesses today target marketing of luxury products to black people in order to put them into debt. 55% of black adults say secret and non-consensual medical experiments, like the Tuskegee study, are happening to black people today. 55% of black adults say the government today encourages single motherhood and the elimination of black men from black families. 51% of black adults say the government promotes birth control and abortion to reduce the size of the black population, and this is happening today. The report also finds that black Americans who have experienced racial discrimination are more likely to believe U.S. institutions intentionally or negligently harm black people. There are also modest differences among black Americans by gender, education, family income, and political affiliation. Still, majorities across many black demographic subgroups are familiar with these statements about the intentions of many U.S. institutions and say these things are happening to black people today. However, Tim Wise would not hesitate to stand up front, opening the eyes of his white contemporaries to the truth of the daily perpetual policies of inequality and black exclusive stereotypes, which white contemporaries would normally look away from. This was him in The Rock Newman Show 9 years ago.
The reason white folks get defensive about the conversation is if you say we're going to talk about racism, white Americans think you're getting ready to call them racist. And that's not what we're not talking about individual racists. I, for one, don't care if Darren Wilson is a racist. What I care about is a culture of policing that engenders the abuse of black and brown people, even among cops who are not bigots. Like, he could be a Boy Scout. He could be a great guy. They had this conversation when George Zimmerman killed Trayvon. And I realized George Zimmerman, technically a Latino, but pretty white identified in terms of his character and who he hangs out with and all that. Here's a guy, they said, well, he's not a racist. He dated a black girl, took her to prom, mentored black children. It doesn't matter, because he is internalizing the same messages from the media, from the schools, that we all are. So we don't have to feel guilty.
What are those messages?
Those messages are that black men are dangerous, because if you look at the news, there have been studies on this. Local news overrepresents black folks as perpetrators, overrepresents white folks as victims. So the message that gets sent is they're dangerous, and specifically to you. They are not only bad people, they're going to hurt you. So therefore, we want to keep them on that side of town. We want to keep their children in those schools over there. We don't want to work around them. We don't want to live around them, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that message comes through loud and clear in the way that media represents people of color. Whenever we, thinking about Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old child that was shot in Cleveland by police, when that happened, what did they do? The first news story in Cleveland that made a big splash was about Tamir Rice's parents and the history of domestic abuse and criminality among his parents, not about the cop that killed him. We talk worse about black victims than we do white killers. What did we say about Ted Bundy? Oh, he was so smart, and he was so quiet, and he always seemed so nice. Every time one of these white boys goes and shoots up a school, what do we say? We had no idea he was going to do this. So we talk better. We have more sympathy for white folks who commit mass murder, bury bodies under the house, cook them up in a soup pot, and eat them, right, than we do black folks who were killed by police. We start digging for every bad thing they ever did. We want to know if they had a juvenile record. We want to know if they'd ever been arrested. That's what the media does. And until that changes, I'm afraid white folks will stay in denial, and it'll be very hard for us to move forward, whether we're talking about cops or just average everyday folks.
And after Wise was through talking, the host would then go on to say,
we have a very diverse viewing audience. White folks comprise some of that viewing audience. Some of them might be sitting out there right now thinking that you don't like white folks.
Described as one of America's great public moralists, and amongst the 25 visionaries who are changing the world, Tim Wise was among the most prominent anti-racist writers and educators in the United States. He has spent the past 25 years speaking to audiences in all 50 states in the U.S.
So far, this colorblind response, this post-racial response that says, oh, let's not name that elephant. Let's not call out what it is we're seeing. Let's redefine it. The most powerful man in the world, arguably, but he can't even name what is obvious. He can't even call it out for what it is. You can't. A cop is not, in fact, disorderly conduct. Not a smart idea. I don't recommend it, but it is not illegal. So when they arrested, critical race theory was created in the late 70s and early 1980s, and no one said anything about it, right? No one really cared outside of sort of picayune debates in law schools, which is where critical race theory is principally applied. So why would all of a sudden it become necessary to attack critical race theory? Because the timing coincides with this uprising, and the idea is to shut down any conversation about racial injustice in America. Because you don't want those white folks to become allies. You don't want those white folks to act in solidarity. You don't want them to learn the truth about the history of the country. And you say it's because you're trying to protect their feelings. That's what they say, right? We don't want white folks to feel bad about being white. Nobody's trying to make anybody feel bad about being white. But if that is your concern, there's a really easy solution. Teach about some different white people. Right? If you're feeling guilty about white folks, and maybe you just need to focus a little less on Andrew Jackson and a little bit more on people like Jeremiah Everts, who was a white man who's one of his principal opponents to indigenous removal. Because there were white folks who stood up against that mess. There were white folks who joined the abolitionist struggle, whose names we don't know. Lydia Marie Child, the Grimke sisters, John Fee, an abolitionist preacher who was defrocked from his church by the Presbyterian Synod because he refused to minister to slaveholders, founded Berea College in Kentucky. Right? Why don't we know these people's names? Why don't we teach these white anti-racist allies who acted in solidarity with black peoples? Right? Because if you're concerned that anti-racists like me are trying to make white people feel bad about being white, and I'm telling you, no, there are these other role models that we could have, Why don't you want to teach about them? That would be the solution to white guilt, right? You don't have to feel guilt and shame when you know you got a choice to make. And here are these examples of people who made that choice. Joan Trump-Auer Mulholland in the civil rights struggle, Bob and Dottie Zellner, Connie Curry, Virginia Foster Durr. Like, I could go down this list, all these names of people who have fought. Some of them died for the cause of racial equity. There haven't been enough of us. The first Congress in this country did after the ratification of the Constitution, right? What's the first thing that Congress did after the Constitution was ratified in terms of legislation? Because you got to assume whatever they did first is their way of saying this is the most important thing, right? Like, that makes sense. You don't do the most important thing like seventh. You do it first, right? So you might think to yourself, well, gosh, I don't know, Tim, maybe the first thing they did was make sure that they had a sufficient army in case the Brits decided to come back and have another run at it. No, that's not what they did. Or you might say, well, maybe they needed to figure out the tax structure so they could figure out how to finance the government. So maybe they did that first. No. They did that, but they didn't do that first. Right? The very first substantive piece of legislation that Congress passed after the Constitution was ratified was a thing called the Naturalization Act of 1790. It's not something we learn about in history class, very many of us in high school. I certainly didn't. And I was in AP history, which they say is the history for the smart kids, right? But they apparently didn't think we were smart enough to handle this truth, even in the 1980s, let alone now with all this backlash happening. What did the Naturalization Act of 1790 say? The first thing that Congress decided to take care of. What did it say? It said that all free white persons and only free white persons could be citizens of the United States. In other words, the most important order of business in the mind of the founders and the first Congress was to make sure that everybody understood, before we dealt with the army, before we dealt with taxes, before we dealt with tariffs, before we dealt with any of the economic stuff, just make sure y'all know that this new thing here is for us and only us. And nobody who is not white will be considered a citizen of the United States. That tells me that white supremacy is there at the birth, right? It, of course, was there before that, really going back to the colonial period. But I'm just saying, in the actual history of the country's laws, it's there from the beginning. Again, not an opinion. There is no rebuttal to what I just said. It happened, and it reads exactly as I say it reads, with the intention that I suggest it had. So then the question is, do we understand what the legacy of that kind of germ of white supremacy is? Do we just assume that that doesn't matter, that it doesn't bear fruit? Right? Do we assume that the policies that flowed from that assumption about who could be a citizen and who couldn't, that those policies would create damage perhaps in their own time but not in ours? As if somehow you just flick a switch, you pass a law, and all of the inertia of the past several generations goes away?
With unflinching honesty, Wise did uncover the deeply buried secrets of America's past, revealing the enduring legacy of racial injustice that had been deliberately obscured.
See, here's the thing. If I were to ask people, whether it was this room or any other room in America, do you believe that systemic racism and white privilege or advantage are real in 2023, we'd get a lot of people who would say yes, and a lot of people who racism and white advantage or privilege in, let's say, 1963 or 1962, before the civil rights laws were on the books. My guess is just about everybody would agree that that would be true, right? Even people whose politics were very different than mine, even people who denied the problem today in 2023, would probably go along with the idea that 60 years ago it was real, right? Because it doesn't really take a lot of courage to admit that, right? I mean, it just takes like a Google machine. That's all it takes, right? You just need a Google machine, and you need to know how to use the Google machine, and you could probably find your evidence for that, right? But here's the problem. In 1963, when white Americans were asked that question about themselves and their country at that time, you see, it's different to ask you about 1963 and 2023. But when white folks were asked that question in 1963, when it was happening, when it was the present, not 60 years in the rearview mirror, and they were asked it by the Gallup organization in that year. The question was, do you believe black folks are treated equally in your community in education, housing, and employment? Now, come on, y'all, it's 1963. We know the answer. This is before the Civil Rights Act, before the Voting Rights Act, before the Fair Housing Act. It is the year of the March on Washington, the year that Medgar Evers is shot down dead in his driveway in Jackson, Mississippi, the year that Governor Wallace stands in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama and says, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. It is the year that he turns those dogs and water cannons in Birmingham on those children at the behest of Bull Connor. So we know the answer to the question. This is not a hard pop quiz. The answer, one, is that white folks are just so stupid and ignorant and cold-hearted that they just can't see, or just night with the Pledge of Allegiance or the national anthem, and then it just was like gray matter for like 6 hours until it came back on. So the idea that you could have somehow missed what was happening in Birmingham, missed what was happening in Mississippi, missed what was happening during the March on Washington, 200,000 people on the mall down the road, right? How could you miss it? It's not like you, oh, I'm sorry, I was watching Netflix. No, you weren't. You were watching Walter Cronkite, because it's all there was.
He relentlessly urged the white nation in general to quit racial injustice and stand up for what's right and just.
Even when people are generally very progressive in the way that they think about a number of social issues. When we talk about race and we talk about racism, we almost always focus on the other, right? Those who were different from the dominant norm, whatever the dominant norm may be. So we put the spotlight on them and therefore the pressure. We put the attention on them and therefore the pressure. We may ask, for instance, what's wrong with them? And how can we fix them? How can we bring them, whoever they may be, into the mainstream of the economy? How can we bring them into the mainstream of the economic and educational systems? How can we make their lives better? And what do we need to know about them so as to help them improve their lives? But the underlying assumption of all of those statements and all of those things, even if they are well-intended and sound nice, the underlying assumption of all of them is that the deficit is to be found in the marginalized population, that they are the ones with the deficit, that they are the ones who need to be fixed. But what if the deficit is in the dominant culture, and we're just not paying attention to that? What if the conditions of life experienced by marginalized populations, whether First Nations peoples here in Canada, whether Indigenous and First Nations peoples in the United States, or African Americans or Latinos in the United States, whoever it is, all the assets you were able to develop, all the revenue you were able to generate, I can't wait to take advantage of that. But as for all those outstanding debts that you ran up, like your bills and the loans that you took out so that you could grow the company, no, I don't have any intention of paying those. That was the last CEO. You really should have gotten him or her to do that. You know, I'm new, I'm innocent, I just got here, you see. There's a difference between guilt and responsibility.
Hello brothers and sisters, welcome back to the channel. You will agree with me that everything that Dr. Tim Wise has said, Tim Wise is anti-racist educator, and he has been talking about this for the longest time. And I understand that he's been called names for doing what he's doing. He's been called a puppet for what he's been doing. But at the end of the day, try to look at this critically. Do you think the United States doesn't need this conversation? Because honestly, for me, I feel like the United States really needs all these conversations. And it is time for people to come out and talk about this, because it's really, really important. Another thing that I don't like to talk about is white deflection. Majority of people that don't want Mr. Tim Wise talk about all these things is that they really know that these things are happening in the United States. And as a result, they have been benefiting from it, because get to see that Dr. Tim Wise is a person that speaks, is that white person that speaks about things that white people feel uncomfortable to talk about, or the things that white people with their intrusive minds, they could say, but they cannot say it openly because for some reasons they are going through what is called cognitive dissonance or cognitive dissidence, how some people call it. But at the end of the day, he faces backlash for speaking about this. This is a conversation that I feel like America needs today. Some people are struggling with racism. It is because they were indoctrinated. So many times we've seen Tim Wise use his lived experiences, how he's surviving police just because he's white. And these are discussions that someone will come and say that, oh, this is something which is long overdue. You don't have to talk about it. He's talked about redlining and how the black community is disadvantaged from the start. But nobody will allow you to talk about this, because when you talk about redlining and white privilege, they go hand in hand. Redlining was a factor which the black community houses were marked red to mean that they could not get loans, to mean that they could not get any government support, while the white community got all these services. And so in one of Dr. Tim White's videos, when he was trying to discuss about he was driving down in the black neighborhood and he was driving alongside with the kid, with this with this kid, and the kid will see a strange thing in the black community. He will see like there is difference when you try to look at structure, the environment, and how just everything looks. The kid could see that things are different from the white community that he comes from. And then Dr. Tim Morris will say that from the eyes, the way he looked at his kid looking at the black community, he knew that this kid is discovering something different. And so all this proves and all this shows you that there is a disparity when it comes to all these places. And that's why these talks are so much important. Brothers and sisters, I didn't have much to say about this video, but I just wanted to shed light on this, because these, and I'll say it and I'll say it again, these are the discussions that the United States need to have. We need to have white people that are ready to speak about all these uncomfortable truths. Because at the end of the day, this is all the America needs. This is all what the United States needs. We need truth-speaking people. Because you get to realize that since a lot of people are lied to that, if you remain white, you're going to be getting all these benefits, but they ain't going to get no benefit from Mr. Donald Trump. And so to have a long-lasting solution, the best way to deal with all these problems is just to accept that you have played a part in the suffering of black people, either directly or indirectly or without knowing. Because the systems that have protected you is the same system that is making black people go through what they're going through, even today. And so, brothers and sisters, please let me know what you feel and think about this video. But until then, let me see you in my next video. If you're watching me for the first time, please subscribe to the channel, join the membership. I really get to see what I can offer you. And man, I'm really, really grateful. Have a beautiful day from wherever you're watching me from. And again, I'm hoping to see you on my next video. Until then, peace, love, and harmony. Salute.